embodying the Jesuit commitment to faith, justice, and solidarity. I leave you now with Father Strassburger.
Terrific. Thank you so much for the introduction, Maria, and for everyone for joining us. I appreciate the invite to come and share with you today. So, as Maria said, I'm the director of our Border Ministry project. That's a project of the U.S. Central and Southern Jesuit Province. We've been around for about 4 years, so I'm humbled to be able to share this for my experiences, both work on the border and accompany migrants who are throughout the country. So I'm going to share my screen, and you can follow along with the slides to try and provide some more details and pictures and put some faces to some of the names that I'll share and that sort of thing. So I'm going to share my screen now. So the title of my talk is Ignatian Accompaniment of Migrants Through Kidnappings and Criminalization. And so Ignatian, talking about kind of, I know this is a Marianal group, but as a Jesuit, just want to kind of approach it from an Ignatian lens, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, because that's the lens through which we approach our ministry here accompanying migrants. And we accompany migrants through situations of real trauma, from kidnappings and abuses that happen to migrants in their migrant journey to the criminalization of migrants that's become widespread, especially in our country. A brief overview of my talk is to kind of answer that question of how does our faith call us to accompany migrants who face kidnapping, exploitation, and criminalization. I'm going to start by introducing our border ministry. I'm going to talk about the current dynamic as I see it, both in the country and on the border. I'm going to do that through the sharing of stories, especially people that I've come to know and accompanied in my ministry. I'd like to reflect on what a Catholic and Ignatian approach invites us to consider in light of this reality, and close by offering some practical suggestions before opening it up for questions. So let's jump in. When we arrived here in 2021 on the US-Mexico border, we met with the local bishop, Bishop Daniel Flores, who just so happened to just get elected the vice president of the USCCB this week in their meetings in DC, which we're thrilled about. When we met with Bishop Flores, we were a new team. We had come to the diocese without a clear, concrete plan of what we were going to do. And Bishop Flores sat down and he talked with us upon our arrival, and he said, "I want you to do what I think Jesuits do best." Wasn't sure what kind of answer he's going to give. He said, "I want you to read the reality and respond to it." And so that's what we've been trying to do ever since, is to be attentive to the needs, to the evolving dynamic that takes place on the border over time, and to find ways that we as a community of Jesuits can respond to it. So our mission statement is that we offer privileged and preferential religious care to the poor, with a focus on pastoral accompaniment and sacramental ministry with the migrant population on both sides of the US-Mexico border. Our ministry is itinerant, which is to say we don't run migrant camps or shelters. That's important to help care for migrants and provide food and housing. And we visit a variety of different shelters, but we don't staff one and run one. We go to wherever migrants are, which could be more in one city than another. It could be more on one side of the border than another. Our ministry is flexible and discerning, so we don't have a rigid schedule. We flex and make discernment about ways that we have to change. And I'm going to talk about some of that, how that's taken place certainly in this past year. Our ministry also includes other components like humanitarian aid, collaboration, and immigration advocacy. So what does it mean? Principally, what it means is that we visit migrant camps and shelters to celebrate Mass. You know, the first time I walked into the migrant plaza in Reynosa that in 2021 had several hundred people living in a really densely packed camp in just tents. It was muddy when it rained. It was uncomfortable, not great living conditions. The first thing that sticks out to you is just the humanitarian needs. You know, can we get them better places to sleep and to live? Can we get them better food? Can we get them access to bathrooms? That's what jumps out right away. But as we were walking with and accompanying people, we became attentive to their spiritual needs as well. And we said, you know, there's a lot of organizations providing humanitarian aid, and we can be one of them. But what's something that no one else here can do? Well, we're priests. We can celebrate Mass. And so it started then in the Plaza of Reynosa, has expanded to all the shelters that we visit right now. where we bring a little mass kit. We often just throw an altar cloth over a table, invite people to gather around on benches and chairs and join us for the celebration of the Mass. And we see how impactful it is for people to have that touchstone moment to connect with their faith and to be attentive to God's movement in their lives. The vast majority of the migrants we meet here on the border are Christian, and a lot of them are either Catholic or have a good familiarity with the Catholic faith. And so we invite them to gather to listen to the Word of God in the celebration of the Eucharist. And you can see how much it impacts them when you see, a migrant bow their head as they pray for God's mercy, when you see them raise up their arms as we pray the Padre Nuestro, the Our Father together, or when they come up to receive the Eucharist or a blessing and might be sometimes moved to tears at those moments. And because we build that trusted relationship by celebrating the sacraments with people, we visit any camp or shelter we go to. We do it twice a week to help us kind of develop relationships with the people there. And then it opens up great opportunities for us, both to gain information from their lived experiences and to share information with them. So what do I mean by that? Well, part of what I mean by that is, migrants, like many people, get their information from social media. Sometimes that's reliable, sometimes it's not. So oftentimes we get a lot of questions about border dynamics. Oh, I hear the border's going to open up in the new year. Is that true? We can dispel those rumors and provide correct information about what the dynamic is like on the border because we're a trusted source. And then at the same time, we also hear the on-the-ground concerns of migrants because they'll come up and they'll talk with us and they'll say, hey, this is one of the issues we're facing, or here's something going on. And so we can elevate those at a higher level to advocates. Like there was a time when a little over a year ago when it was like, man, it seemed like half the people arriving at the Matamoros airport, coming up through Mexico, were being kidnapped from the taxis outside the Matamoros airport, being held for a couple of days, a ransom demanded from their families, just horrible things. And we were finding this out because they'd show up at the shelter afterwards, say, yeah, I just got released from being kidnapped. Yeah, I just got released from being kidnapped. Well, they shared those stories with us and we elevated it to local authorities. And within a month or two, the municipal government started offering a free bus ride for migrants arriving at the hotel to get them to the shelter. So that's some of our local advocacy that came about just because of that trusted relationship we have with migrants and our presence being in shelters with such frequency. So that's a little bit about what our ministry looks like. We also do our own work in communications, producing a weekly newsletter and a podcast that's now in its 9th season. And I'll give a shout out to that later in the presentation as well. So I want to return to that question that Bishop Flores invited us to consider as we got here. He said his instruction to us was read the reality and respond to it. So let's start with what is the reality? The current dynamic in the United States, now all this changed in January 20th, 2025, when the new administration was sworn in. And beginning on that date, there is no legal entry for someone seeking asylum coming to the southern border, the US-Mexico border. The dynamic for the last 2 years of the Biden administration was that if someone had a smartphone app called CBP1, you could download that on your phone, fill out advanced information, and request an appointment to legally enter the country. And those appointments were scheduled for several weeks out. On January 20th, all the migrants who were in Mexico who had one of those confirmed appointments, which was most of the people living along the border in the shelters, received a notification. It came in while President Trump was still in the Capitol building. He'd been sworn in, but they hadn't even finished up the events when a message was sent to all users of the CBP1 app in Mexico saying, this application will no longer be used by non-citizens to schedule legal entry, and all scheduled appointments are permanently canceled. That affected everybody along the border who had scheduled appointments for legal entry in the United States, including Edwin and his wife and son. They had fled Colombia because the local gang there was trying to recruit Edwin's preteen son, 12, 13, I mean, he's now 14, but it was 12, 13 at the time, to join them. And it got to the point where Edwin was just really afraid of the trouble that his family was going to be in. And so fled the country, came up to Mexico. They were in Mexico City requesting an appointment with this smartphone app in late 2024. And they eventually got that appointment. They got that appointment scheduled for January 15th to legally enter through Matamoros. And that's 5 days before the inauguration. So they felt pretty good about what was going to happen, that they were going to legally come to the United States to be able to seek asylum. They took a bus up to the border from Mexico City. And as they were pulling into the border town of Reynosa before getting to Matamoros, an official came on and asked any migrant who was traveling in this area to get off the bus. So Edwin and his wife and son got off the bus. That's when this supposed official told them and others that you have all now been kidnapped by the Gulf Cartel. They put him in another form of transportation, took him to a house, hid him in a room, and took photos of them and sent it to their family, demanding a ransom. The family gathered their resources as quickly as they could, paid for their ransom, and on January 18th, 3 days after their scheduled appointment, they were released from their kidnapping. Still 2 days before the presidential inauguration. So we, with the help of other advocates, got Edwin and his family from Reynosa to Matamoros to a shelter on the 18th, and then on the 19th they went to the bridge in Matamoros. Now they were 4 days late for their appointment, but they had missed their appointment because they were kidnapped. And we had worked with local authorities for Mexican immigration and U.S. immigration to still process those cases when we could confirm that someone had missed their appointment just because they'd been kidnapped. Well, they show up that day on the 19th, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP officers at the bridge denied them entry, said, "I'm sorry, we're over capacity today. We can't take you today. Please come back tomorrow." Well, tomorrow was January 20th. And that was the day that the notice went out that all CBP-1 appointments had been permanently canceled. We are now in the month of November, and Edwin and his family are still living in Matamoros, Mexico, stuck because of situations beyond their control. And they try to do everything right. They waited for the appointment with CBP-1. They came up to enter on time. They were kidnapped through no fault of their own. They got released before the inauguration, and still they were denied entry to our country. So that's part of what the border dynamic looks like after January 20th. What's happening around our country? Well, on the US side, along the border, shelters are empty. Like shelters we used to visit in Brownsville, Texas and McAllen, Texas are empty. And migrants across the country, and that's just because no one has any form of legal entry. And the border isn't usually a place of destination, it's a place of transit for people making their way to destinations across the country. And migrants across the country are living in real fear. The government has made it clear they want to deport a lot of migrants, and they say, we're going to deport all the criminals. There's a problem with that. There aren't many criminals among the migrant population. Like those who have committed any sort of violent crime, it's less than the average US citizen. And so what do you do if you want to deport a lot of people, only criminals, but you have very few criminals? You have to make more criminals. And so what we see is the criminalization of the migrant population. What are some ways you can do that? You can do that by requiring undocumented migrants to register nationally and saying if you don't register nationally, it's a felony. Because entering the country illegally is not a felony, it's just a misdemeanor. It's like if you sped on your way home from work, you'd commit a misdemeanor. So to make undocumented entry more of a criminal offense, you ask undocumented migrants to register, and if they don't register, now you say they've committed a felony. Another thing you could do is you can revoke protected status for populations, basically try to grow the undocumented population. There are thousands of people in our country who have protections like TPS, which is an acronym for temporary protective status. Some people with TPS have been here for over 25, 30 years. But it's a temporary status that the president has the power to revoke. We can also think about people who have DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals. There are thousands of people in the United States who were brought here as small children who have gotten a temporary protection that's renewable, but could also be revoked. It has not yet been revoked, while some forms of TPS have been revoked. So that's a way to all of a sudden grow your population of people who don't have a legal right to be here any longer. And by the way, people with TPS and DACA have been given no way of regularizing their status, of becoming a permanent resident or a citizenship. It's not provided in their protections. So they had no way to do anything differently. Another thing this administration is doing is dismissing the legality of previous processes, like that CBP-1 smartphone app that people entered the country legally with for several years under the Biden administration. It's one that the current administration says was the illegal Biden app that let criminals into our country. And so they say, if you use that app, you entered illegally. Even though as a migrant, you're thinking, I did everything exactly the right way, exactly the way US government told me to enter this country. Criminalization of migrants. There's also ways that you can broaden the definition of gang membership. We see ICE saying that if someone has certain tattoos or social media posts, that's enough evidence to say you are a gang member without looking for any further evidence, like actual gang activity, for example. And also they're using novel strategies to curtail due process to help increase detention and fast-track deportations. these are a lot of detailed ways. I'd like to kind of put some flesh on it and share the story of a couple of people that I know. So Isis is one that I'd like to share about. Isis, a migrant from Venezuela, came to the United States as a single adult, was very active against the Maduro government in Venezuela, and so fled for his own safety. Came up to the US-Mexico border and started using the smartphone app for legal entry, and was staying in the city of Matamoros at a shelter that we visit regularly, the Pumarejo shelter in Matamoros. And Isis drew close to us right from the beginning, because when he saw Catholic priests were showing up and celebrating Mass at his shelter, he said, "Oh, I'm a former seminarian. I was in the seminary studying to be a priest." And, he decided that wasn't his vocation, but his faith was clearly very important to him. He became one of our lectors. He would help us as a Eucharistic minister. And then at one point he came up to us and said, "Fathers, it's great that you come here 2 days a week and do Mass, but I feel like we need something more. Would it be okay with you?" And he asked us, "Would it be okay with you if I organized a daily rosary?" Jesus, of course it would be okay with us. What a great idea. And so the sisters donated him this little triptych of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and he started organizing a daily rosary group at the shelter. Well, after a couple of months of waiting, he got his CBP1 appointment in February of 2024, about a year and a half ago. Entered the United States, went up to Michigan, got a job, got an apartment, started a life for himself, applied for asylum. We had a change of government, of course, this January. He'd been in the country almost a year at that point. And come April, he had an ICE check-in. It wasn't a court date, just a regular check-in with ICE to verify he is where he is and that kind of thing. Generally, that's a routine kind of a visit. Well, Isis went in for his checkup, and they moved him immediately into a detention facility. Did not release him back to his apartment and his job. Why would they do that? Well, they said the tattoos, Isis has tattoos on his arms. He said, our government said, those tattoos identify you as a member of the Tren de Aragua gang in Venezuela. And so you're a danger to the American public, so we need you to be detained for the duration of your immigration proceedings. Isis is not a gang member, right? I mean, if he is, he's got the greatest act. He's put on the greatest act ever. I'm going to draw close to the priests. I'm going to start organizing a daily rosary so they'll never suspect that I'm this dangerous gang member that's coming to the United States to do terrible things. Or maybe he's just not a gang member. Maybe he just likes tattoos, like my sister, and yet he's been languishing in detention since April. He's been in a really sad, depressed place. He had a court date postponed in August. His health is not doing well, especially his mental health. And so I just talked to him a couple of days ago, and he's asking his lawyer to petition for him to get deported to Venezuela, because he would rather go back and face the potential dangers in his home country than languish in prison. We call it a detention center, but it is prison, where he continues to languish, which is part of this administration's tactic. Get people in detention and have them give up and not fight their legal case in court, even when it's someone like Isis who has a legitimate fear of returning to his home country. Another person that paints the reality of the situation is Carlos, a migrant from Nicaragua who entered the United States in 2019. He was politically active against the Ortega government in Nicaragua that's converted into a dictatorship. He's been living in the country for 6 years, doing everything right, going to every court date. He has a son who was born here 3 years ago. Well, he showed up to court in immigration court in Harlingen, Texas, a couple months ago, and I was there with some other activists. And Carlos walked in. He had a backpack with him. He sat down at the courtroom. The judge walked in, and she explained to him the following steps of his process. He was taking good notes. She was explaining everything that he would have to do, all the next steps, when his next court date would be, etc. Everything seemed to be going just fine. It was 20, 25 minutes. And then as the judge was wrapping up, she turned to the other person sitting in that courtroom, which was a representative of the government, the Department of Homeland Security. He had been sitting there kind of typing away on his computer. Didn't seem like he was paying too much attention. But when the judge asked him, does the government have anything to say about this case? He looked up at the judge and leaned into the microphone and said, "Yes, Your Honor, the government moves to dismiss the case." Dismiss the case? Well, Carlos didn't want to dismiss the case. He wanted to fight his case for asylum. That's why he had submitted it. That's why he was here this day. And the judge said, okay, we're going to accept the motion of the government to dismiss this case. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that Carlos now has no pending procedures in immigration court. So as he steps out of the courthouse with us by his side, two masked officers for ICE are there. They call him aside. They take his backpack. They put him in handcuffs and put him in an unmarked vehicle. They took him to a detention center. They moved him over to Alexandria, Louisiana, and then deported him back to Nicaragua. He didn't have time to go home and pack a bag, say goodbye to his son, who's a US citizen. He was picked up that day in court for what? Doing the right thing, showing up, trying to follow the rules that we put in place for him. But he was trapped and detained and deported. This is a situation that's happening in immigration courts every single day in our country. Carlos is just one example, one narrative of families being separated, of people being violently taken by masked agents for ICE and immigration. That's a reality taking place around our country right now. How about the reality on the Mexican side of the border? I get a lot of questions. It must just be packed with migrants. It's because no one can get in, and so they must just be filling up the shelters. The truth is, the shelter population is extremely low. There are very few people living in shelters on the border. No one's coming up to the border because they've heard the news that there's no legal form of entry. And so the population of migrants and asylum seekers is very low. Migrants who have been on the shelter, have been on the border since the change of government, we're basically left with four options as the Trump administration took over. One option is, okay, now there's no legal form of entry in the United States. Well, I guess I have to try to enter through another means, which is to say, enter undocumented, right? So hire some coyote to try to sneak you in the country, get you past Border Patrol, get you north to your destination so you can live in the United States undocumented. As soon as Trump was sworn into office, the price of that fee from coyotes quadrupled and now costs between $10,000 and $15,000 for someone to take one attempt to enter the country undocumented. That's way too expensive for many migrants to even dare to attempt. I know, maybe a dozen people who have tried this route, who have tried to enter the country undocumented. Many of them don't have success, right? Like I think about Carlos, a guy from Honduras, who tried to enter. Oh, sorry, Carlos. No, Samuel from Honduras tried to enter undocumented, got picked up by Border Patrol. We saw him in a detention center in the United States a couple weeks later. He ended up deported back to Honduras just a couple weeks after that. After paying all that money, trying on this attempt, ends up getting detained and deported. But some people do have success. I think about Rosie. Rosie, her husband lives in Houston. She'd been separated from him for a number of years after he had legally entered the country before. And so when the border got closed, her husband saved up money, sent it to her for her to pay to sneak into the country. She made it up to Houston. They got reunited. And how did she get up there? You kind of think, okay, this woman unattended, does she have to swim across the river and climb over a giant fence and that kind of thing? Giant wall, border wall. No, she actually entered the country riding in the passenger seat of a car entering the United States. The coyotes had bribed one of the Border Patrol officers. I don't know how many times they've done this, but just allowed that car to go through without even reviewing her lack of passport and paperwork to legally enter the country. So corruption exists even in U.S. Authority figures. And, okay, she made it up to Houston. She's with her husband, but now she has to live undocumented, where in a time when the country is trying to look for people to detain and deport. So a very precarious existence for Rosie. That's one option, considering other methods to enter the U.S. undocumented. Another option is some people return home if they think it's safe enough to do so. Okay, I think about someone like Karen. Karen is from Honduras. She's a single mom, 2 kids, school-age kids. She was in a shelter in Reynosa. Never got that appointment with the CBP1 app. Border law changed January 20th, and she stuck around for 6 months. She stuck around till the summer came, just waiting to see if some change would come in the border dynamic that would allow them safe entry into the United States. And it never came. And so she was crying to me the day that she was talking about her decision to go home. She said, I'm so worried about my kids. I want to get them into school. They've missed this entire school year on this migrant journey, an entire school year. I need to get them into school. And she was crying because she said, I've got a sister who's legally in the country, who's in Dallas, Texas. That's where we were going to go. And some of my other family members have been telling me I need to send my kids alone across the border, because she knows that unaccompanied minors, migrants under 18 who enter without a parent, get treated differently than adults, and they do get processed by the U.S. and they can be released to family members who are legal in the country. And so some of Karen's family members were telling her, do that with your kids, get them into the United States, they'll get into better schools and have a better future. And that's why Karen was crying to me that day. She said, am I being selfish that I don't want to be separated from my kids? Am I denying them a better future? I assured her she's a great parent. She's making these decisions precisely because she loves her kids. And I know, and she knows that it's going to be very hard for them if they were to be separated from their mother. And so Karen made that decision and returned to Honduras with her kids. And they're doing fine. They're at her mom's house. The kids are in school. They're doing great. Not everyone makes the same decision Karen made. Jacqueline is another woman who is living in a shelter in Reynosa. She's got two kids, school age as well, and she's got a sister living legally in Miami in the United States. And so her and her husband made a different decision from Karen. They sent their two kids across the border. They were processed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now, usually that processing takes about a month on average, but under the Trump administration, they delayed the processing. So they were in U.S. custody for 3 months before finally getting released to Jacqueline's sister in Miami, where they're now in school and getting situated in the United States, but separated from their mom and dad, right? What a difficult experience. For some people, they can't go home. It's unsafe. And so, I think about Junior, a migrant from Haiti, who has said, I cannot go back to Haiti. The situation there is horrific. It's extremely dangerous. Gang violence. I need to do something different. And so he's not going to enter the country undocumented. He can't return home. But he decided to relocate to a safer part of the country of Mexico, because the border can be very dangerous and is very dangerous. So he relocated to Monterrey. Now, some people relocated to Monterrey, like Junior, have found work. He's working in construction. He's got an apartment. He's doing okay. Others like um, Others like Jackie, she went down to the border. She's got two kids. One of them's below school age. And so she's just still living in a shelter, having a hard time trying to make a way for herself and her family. Other people haven't relocated around Mexico because they're just waiting on the border. And that's the population that remains. That's that fourth option available. People just waiting in shelters on the border. It's a very low population, but it's a lot of families. It's a lot of single moms with kids because they can't work because they got to care for their kids. Or people with physical disabilities. So that's part of the reality for those who are waiting. Or they're from a country like Venezuela. It's very far away, and they might not even have a passport, a Venezuelan passport. It might have been taken from them when they were kidnapped. And so they don't really have any other options. And so they just kind of continue to wait and get about their life. But if you're waiting in one of the shelters and still living there on the border, life is not on pause. Life continues, and you have to find ways to make it work. Give a couple examples of that. Catalina is from Colombia, along with her three kids. Her mom was murdered in Colombia, and so she filed charges to the district attorney and then received death threats against her life. And so rather than take a risk with that, she fled with her kids and came to the U.S.-Mexico border. She had an appointment for CBP-1 for early February that got canceled because the government shut down all those appointments. And she's continued to live in Matamoros. And at the start of Lent this past year, we offered to anybody in that shelter that if they want to have their kids baptized or receive First Communion, we would do catechism to form them and prepare them to receive those sacraments on the Easter Vigil. Catalina immediately signed up her three kids, and she came with them to catechism every week. And it was so lovely. The first time that we had catechism, she was sitting right next to me, and she was just sitting at the edge of her seat, and she kept throwing her hand up to like answer different questions. And I'm like, Catalina, like this is for your kids, She's like, I am just thrilled to be here. I am just loving learning about my faith. Just so eager and excited to engage with her faith and learn more about it. So it was a beautiful celebration we had on the Easter Vigil when we baptized and gave First Communion to so many of the youth and kids staying at the shelter in Matamoros, and how life doesn't just go on pause. And Catalina's taken advantage to grow deeper in her faith along with her children. Another person is Nicole. Nicole, single woman, no kids, from Honduras, came up to the border, got a CBP-1 appointment that got canceled, still living in Reynosa. But she signed up for a program offered by her shelter to go to beauty school, like a beauty salon school. And she learned how to do nail care, how to care for nails, how to treat nails, how to put on the like kind of acrylic nails and to paint designs on them, the kind of thing any 15-year-old girl wants for a quinceañera, or 14-year-old girl wants for a quinceañera, or for weddings or things like that. And so when we had her graduation from her beauty school, she was just beaming. She said, Father Brian, I just feel so proud of myself. This is something I always wanted to do and never thought I'd have the opportunity to do. life isn't on pause, still taking advantage of opportunities to grow and develop skills along with other migrants living along the border. So that's a reality as I see it about what's going on in the country and on the US-Mexico border. So now I want to return to that instruction from Bishop Flores: read the reality and respond to it. So if this is the reality that we see along the border in the country right now, how are we to respond to it? Well, our response, of course, is going to be informed by our faith. It's going to be a Catholic response. And as we know, there is a biblical call to welcome the stranger. It goes back to the Old Testament, to the oldest books of the Bible that talk about how you shall not oppress or afflict the foreigner, for you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. It's mentioned over 30 times in the first 5 books of the Bible, the call to welcome the stranger. And then, of course, we have the story of the Holy Family, who themselves were refugees, fleeing the dangers of Herod and fleeing to Egypt themselves based on a dream where the Lord appeared to Joseph and instructed him to flee to Egypt to take care of the Holy Family. We have the great story of the judgment of the nations told in Matthew 25. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. And I'm reminded of the letters of St. Paul when he writes to the Corinthians. There are many parts, yet one body. We are all one body in Christ. And if one part suffers, if a migrant is suffering on the border, we suffer with that person, that member of the body of Christ. Beyond the biblical call, we also can think about how hospitality has long been a marker of the church and of our faith. In the ancient Roman Empire, Christian communities were marked by their hospitality, welcoming the stranger, inviting not only fellow tribe members to stay under their care, but anybody who came through and was in need. We can think about the ancient rule of Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine order, who talked about receiving every guest that knocks on the door as Christ himself. The Catholic Church today is the largest global social service provider, which echoes this tradition, this rich tradition in the history of our faith. We were in the United States the largest refugee resettlement program until the funding for that got cut by the new administration. And so there's the biblical roots, there's the rich tradition and history of our church, and of course Catholic social teaching, which invites us to consider the preferential option for the poor, being mindful of always caring first and foremost for the poor and in need. Our social teaching reminds us that migrants have a right to stay in their country, to live in conditions that allow them to provide for themselves and their families. And they also have a right to move, a right to migrate if they can't experience those conditions in their home country. So how are we attending to that right people have to move and to migrate, seeking a better future for themselves and their families? We're very moved and inspired by the words of Pope Francis, perhaps the greatest advocate globally for migrants, and then passed away, of course, in April of this year. He wrote in his exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, I want to say with regret that the worst discrimination which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The great majority of the poor have a special openness to the faith. They need God, and we must not fail to offer them his friendship, his blessing, his word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in the faith. Our preferential option for the poor must mainly translate into a privileged and preferential religious care. That gets back to what I was saying at the very beginning, where when you enter a migrant camp or shelter, the first thing you're going to notice are the humanitarian needs because they're the most obvious. But Pope Francis reminds us that we need to be attentive to the spiritual needs of people as well. How are we caring for their spiritual needs? And if we want to talk about a preferential option for the poor, that has to include preferential religious care. That inspires us in our response to the reality that we find here on the US-Mexico border. And we also, of course, take an Ignatian approach, as I said at the beginning, inspired by our founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola, which requires discernment. Ignatius was all about discernment, using the tools of the Spirit to be attentive to where the Holy Spirit is inviting us to go. Where are the current needs? Where is the magis, the more, the greater good that we can pursue? We've had to engage in a discernment process, especially after January 20th. We went from splitting our focus between going to US shelters and Mexican shelters here on the border to increasing our focus on the Mexican side of the border, since US shelters are now basically empty. We were working with vulnerable cases of migrants who were in Mexico who could not wait for an appointment with the CBP1 app because of medical emergencies, late-term pregnancies, people being actively pursued by the cartel. But now, with no way to advocate for migrants to enter the country, the vulnerable cases are migrants in the US who have a court date and are afraid of being treated like Carlos, having their case dismissed, so they're detained and deported. So we've had to shift gears and directions in our own ministry. And we're always being attentive to what our emerging needs. We've started going to local ICE detention facilities here in South Texas because those aren't going anywhere soon, and we're going to continue to have a population with this administration. We're looking at being more attentive to the Mexicans who are being deported back to Mexico and deported into the border cities that we visit. We're considering ways to provide legal aid for migrants in the country, knowing that in immigration court, you have the right to a lawyer, but you're not guaranteed a lawyer. So if I go out and kill someone, I'm guaranteed in criminal court to be represented by an attorney, even if I can't afford one. But in immigration court, if you can't afford an attorney, you have to represent yourself. And we know that a migrant is 5 times more likely to be granted asylum if they just have legal representation that knows the way to correctly navigate the legal system and present the evidence that a migrant has for their asylum claim. And so we're thinking about considering ways that we can help provide legal aid for migrants that we know in the country. So what does our response look like? Well, our response right now looks like we spend a lot of time in Mexico visiting shelters. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we go to Reynosa, Mexico, and in the morning, we're at the shelters Senda 1 and Senda 2. Shelters run by an evangelical pastor, Pastor Hector, and his team. But even as Catholics, he welcomes us in to come into the shelter. We celebrate Mass. We've even had baptisms and celebrated Holy Week at shelters run by evangelical pastors because we have a common mission: care for the poor, care for the migrant. In those afternoons, we visit 2 other shelters, Casa del Migrante, run by the Catholic Church, and Casa Lulu, run kind of a house/shelter run by a great migrant advocate in Reynosa. We also visit now just 1 shelter in Matamoros, Mexico. The Pumarejo shelter was closed down about just less like 2 or 3 weeks ago by the Mexican government. And so a lot of those people have relocated to the Casa del Migrante shelter. So that's another shelter that we're visiting there. We go there on Sundays and Wednesdays. I just got back from there right before joining this call as we celebrated Mass with the people who were gathered there. We've got 4 kids at Casa del Migrante right now in Matamoros who are preparing for baptism. I mean, one of them's a newborn baby. So really it's the moms that are kind of preparing for baptism for their children. So Sister Gloria, Dominican sister, was meeting with the mothers this afternoon to kind of instruct them in the faith and prepare them for the baptism of their children. On the U.S. side of the border, we do visit the 1 migrant shelter in our area that has a long-term facility. It's called La Posada Providencia. It's often now, it has very few migrants. Some of the migrants staying there are ones who are in the process of self-deporting back to their home country, but are having to fill out a few steps before they can move on. They're also attentive to the homeless population. So now some of the people who are living there are just members of the homeless population, but we visit there twice a month. And then we go to the Port Isabel Detention Center every Monday and twice a month on Sundays to meet with detained individuals. People have been oftentimes picked up on the street or at their work site, are being detained and in the process of deportation. You know, it's a lot of information, but I always like to tell stories. You know, I've tried to weave some of those into here, and I'd like to add a couple more stories to my presentation before giving you some concrete steps of how you can respond. One of the stories that I want to share is the story of Luis Camacho, a guy from Venezuela who came up to the U.S.-Mexico border. Really, he came to Mexico City first, and he was waiting for an appointment with a smartphone app. This was back in 2023. Wasn't getting an appointment, and so he decided, let me just go to the border. Maybe the appointments will come faster on this app if I'm closer to the border, which wasn't true, but he thought, let me give it a try. And as he came up to the border, Luis was kidnapped. He was held by the cartel for a series of days. He had to pay for a ransom, get released, showed up at the Catholic shelter, Casa del Migrante, which is where we met. And he right away got to work helping out at the shelter. And it would be very common that we'd walk in and Luis would walk right up. He said, hey, Father, you got to talk to this person, you got to talk to this person, you got to talk to this person, because here's some of the needs that they have. So he became an advocate for fellow migrants in the shelter to try and raise their concerns, especially for people who are a little bit more nervous or too timid to approach us. And he always sat in the first row. I mean, he sat in the first row, first pew. I mean, you know, most Catholics, when they walk into Mass, they go to like the last pew as far back in the church as possible. But Luis would always faithfully sit in the very first chair and actively participate in the Mass. He finally got that appointment with the CBP1 app, and in October of 2023, he was getting ready to enter the United States. And so at his final Mass at the shelter with us, we called him forward and gave him a final blessing of safe travels. And then I passed him the microphone to say, is there anything you'd like to share? And he took that microphone. He said, you know, it was really hard for me coming here. I thought the worst decision I made was my decision to come up to Reynosa. because coming up here, I got kidnapped, and that was one of the worst experiences of my life. But he said, God works even through the tough experiences of our life. And now I wonder, this is what he said. He said, now I wonder if that was the best decision I made. Not because of the kidnapping, but because after the kidnapping, I got released to the shelter. I met the Jesuit priests. I met the sisters, the Daughters of Charity who run the shelter. I met all of you here, and none of that would have happened otherwise. And so I give thanks to God that I made that decision because it's changed my life completely. Luis entered the United States and settled in Denver, Colorado, which was very exciting for me because that's my hometown. So I've gone back to Denver a few times and got to connect with Luis. He even bought me coffee, parked his, he's working at a restaurant as a bar back a few days a week. Now, Luis, I should say, is a lawyer by trade, but obviously doesn't have legal credentials in the United States. So he works as a bar back at a restaurant as he's trying to learn English. And he also bicycles around Denver delivering for Uber Eats. But he's helping to support his family back home and doing the best he can. And it was great to see him. And he even paid for my coffee when we got together a few months ago. So a great story of resilience. I'd like to share a story of faith and generosity. And that's the story of Nessie. Nessie, a single mom from Honduras with her two kids, Dylan, top center, and Alexa, bottom center. Nessie and her kids were in the Casa del Migrante shelter, super faithful people. Dylan, the young boy, loved to sing. And so when we get to communion, we'd always give him the mic and he would belt out a cappella this one song. He's a terrible singer, but I would never tell him that. I would never tell him that. He just loved to sing. And so Dylan would sing and join in our mass and just a beautiful family. They eventually got their CBP1 appointment and entered the United States. They went to Charlotte where they reunited with Nessie's sister, who's shown holding Alexa in that picture on the right. So Nessie's holding her niece, who she just met for the first time, who was born recently, and her sister is holding her daughter, Alexa. And they brought balloons to the Charlotte airport to welcome them. And Nessie got a couple jobs, single mom, trying to get by. So she works for the school district during the day and works for Walmart in the evenings, working just basically every day a week to try to help support her kids. They're in school and doing the best they can. Late November, early December last year, Christmas is approaching. The elections had happened, but Trump hadn't taken power yet. And Nessie sent me some text messages to check in, which we do every once in a while. And I was just like, oh yeah, telling her how things were going. People are a little bit anxious about what's coming on the border and what changes will come and this, that, and the other thing. So just talking back and forth. She said, yeah, actually, Father Brian, the reason why I was writing you is because I was in that shelter last year for Christmas, and I know what it's like. And it's not easy to be separated and far from home and far from family. So, I was wondering if maybe I could send you $100 if you could bring that to the sisters to share with migrants at the shelter, and as a way of saying thank you for everyone who took care of me there. She said, and not only that, I've actually talked to 5 other families who were at Casa del Migrante when I was there, and they've all agreed to give $100. So if I sent you $600, could you bring that cash to the sisters in the shelter to help care for the people who are going to be celebrating Christmas there this year? You talk about generosity. I was just so struck by that. A single mom working 2 jobs, spent Christmas in a shelter the year before. She's finally going to spend Christmas in the United States with her kids. And she's thinking about the migrants from that shelter that she was at before. And how can she give back and try to make their experiences a little bit better? Such generosity. I'm reminded of the gospel story where Jesus is in the temple watching people give donations into the treasury. And this poor old widow walks up and puts a few coins in. And Jesus said, who gave the most out of all of them? He said it was that widow because she gave from her own livelihood. When I think about the criminalization of migrants that's happening around our country, I think about people like Nessie and Luis. I mean, these are people that I want to be my neighbors, to be members of my parish, to be colleagues and friends. They're not criminals coming in to steal our jobs and commit violent crimes in our country. They're people that are just trying to do the right thing, live a good life, share their faith, their resilience, their generosity. Immigration is not just a border reality. There's migrants in every community around the country, right? I put little arrows in places where I've known people to be, and this is an incomplete list, but it's true that I have met someone going to every one of the 48 contiguous states in the United States of America. Migrants are in every single community of ours, and they are great contributors to our community, to our culture, to our society. And so immigration is not a border issue. The current administration has made that clear with their workplace raids, with the migrant enforcement that's taking place in cities around the country. It makes headline news in California or Chicago, what's going on, but it's happening in our backyards, in immigration court, and in workplaces and even on the streets. And so we know migrants are in each and every one of our communities. So what can you do if you want to be part of a response? Hearing the reality, how can you help respond? One thing I always invite people to do is come and see the border reality. I think it's important. You know, Jesus issued that invitation to his first disciples, come and see. The border gets talked about in the news all the time, but so often gets mischaracterized. And I think you can change that understanding by coming to visit. So I always invite people. The border's quieter than it was a couple years ago, but it's still really important to see this reality, to see how heavily militarized the border is and what that looks like, to see layers and layers of barbed wire and the kind of message that that sends about what kind of country we are, to visit migrants staying in shelters in Mexico and hear their stories and what brought them to the border, and what their struggles are. You know, it's a very lived human experience. So come and see the reality. You can also volunteer and witness locally. As I said, migrants across the country are living in fear and uncertainty. So how are we helping to care for migrants in our midst, right? I think about the local parish here that I help out at that has many people, as many parishioners who are undocumented migrants who are in real fear. Immigration court, like I went to and have borne witness at, it's open to the public. So find a way to be a witness at your local immigration court. Find out when they have the non-detained docket where migrants are coming in for their meetings. Witness what's going on. Invite other people to join you so that this reality can be brought to light. You can also support organizations and migrants. We have an Amazon wish list. You can give your financial support to help us in our care for our migrant brothers and sisters. You can also advocate for change. Be a voice for the voiceless. Migrants don't have a voice in our political system. They can't vote. And that's part of the reason they're an easy target, because they can't vote, right? I mean, think about it. You say something bad about migrants, it's not going to have any impact on the ballot box. If I were a politician, I said, you know what the problem with our country is? It's the Catholics. Catholics are taking over our country. They're changing our culture. They're coming into our country. They're stealing jobs. I bet if I looked on the internet quick enough, I could find a story of some Catholic who's committed some atrocious crime. And I could show that and be like, Catholics are like this person who commit this atrocious crime. Down with the Catholics. We need to get them out of our country. They're a problem. We need to detain them, deport them. I mean, if I did that, Catholics around the country would be incensed. They would say, this is absurd. This isn't true. You're mischaracterizing us as a people, and you're casting us as the enemy. And all Catholics would vote against that politician. But if I change the word Catholic and insert migrant, now all of a sudden it doesn't have the same impact, because migrants can't vote. Migrants can't rally and say, we're going to vote for a different political ally. And yet that's what's said. Migrants, they're invading our country. They're changing our culture. They're a real problem. Here's one example of a migrant committing a violent crime. This is what migrants are like, right? We need to detain and deport them to make our country safer, right? We make the same accusations, and we do it to migrants. And so what can we do? How can we be a voice for the voiceless? You can call your representatives in Congress and say, hey, immigration is a primary concern of mine, and I want to oppose this program of mass deportations. It's separating families. Every single day, people are being detained and deported who have US-born citizens who are now being separated from their parents, right? People who've lived here for decades, who have a life here, who have no pathway for legalization and now are being deported. We can call for pathways to citizenship, especially for people who've been in a country for a long time, people like DACA recipients or TPS holders, right? And what ways can we offer access to asylum for people seeking safety to our country? So advocate for change. You can also help to change the narrative. It gets told every single day, especially on social media, that migrants are a problem, that migrants are criminals, migrants are stealing our jobs. And that's just not true. Most of the migrants who are accusing of being criminals right now, the only crime they've committed is being in our country as a migrant, many of them doing so legally and pursuing legal avenues to remain here. And we know that migrants enrich and bless our country. We're trying to change the narrative through the work of our podcast. We're coming to an end of season 9. If you listen to podcasts on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere, you can find the Jesuit Border Podcast, where we're trying to help change that narrative by sharing stories of migrants told through our ministry, like the stories I've shared today, and highlighting the great work of people on the border and across the country who work with accompanying migrants. So give a listen to our podcast. And of course, if you want to give to support us, there are a lot of ways to do so. You can visit our website at delcamino.org.